Eminent and distinguished chair and moderator, Mr. A.S. Kiran Kumar, Member Space Commission, former Secretary Department of Space and Chairman ISRO. Ladies and gentlemen, let's once again put our hands together to welcome our eminent chairperson and moderator for this session. And may I invite our eminent keynote speaker, Mr. Luigi Scatteia, who is the partner PwC Global Space Practice Leader. Warm welcome to you. We're just getting your nameplate, sir. I also have the privilege of inviting all our eminent speakers. I invite Professor Sachin Chaturvedi. He is Director General Research and Information Systems, India. Warm welcome to you, sir. Inviting Dr. Ajey Lele, Consultant, Manohar, Parrikar-Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses, MP-IDSA. Inviting Dr. Subba Pavuluri, President SIA-India and CMD Ananth Technologies Private Limited. And also inviting Mr. Girish Chandran, Vice President and CTO, Viasat, Inc. So ladies and gentlemen, the topic for this session, which is track 1, is India's space strategy for future, turning vision into action. So ladies and gentlemen, India's aspiration to stake its rightful claim in the global economy needs to be backed up by the strategy detailing and broad direction for the space industry and spectrum usage. And that is exactly what we are going to discuss and have presentations on in this session. And the time duration for the session is approximately 1 hour 20 minutes, which includes the opening and closing remarks by the distinguished chair and moderator. Keynote presentation by Mr. Luigi Scatteia. He is partner PwC Global Space Practice Leader, and deliberations and discussions by all our eminent speakers. We shall have question and answers in the end, sir. So how would you like to do the question and answers in the end? So ladies and gentlemen, to save time and for easy time management, we would like to have the question and answers in the end after all the presentations and deliberations are over. And with those words, I hand over to our chair and moderator, Mr. A.S. Kiran Kumar, to kindly carry forward the proceedings of this session with your opening remarks, sir. Over to you.
Good morning to all of you, and good morning to fellow panelists for this particular session, India's Space Strategy for Future, Turning Vision into Action. As we have seen, India started its space journey way back in the 60s, and over a period of these 4 decades, it's among the few countries in the world which developed an end-to-end capability of going to space and using space both for space for Earth and space for space. And in this manner, it developed a technological capability and also its application capability. And as we have also seen, that world has seen a very significant change in the way things are happening. Today, while living on planet Earth itself has become an issue both because of the climate change and also the manner in which the development is making life on Earth more difficult. Now using space for understanding how things happen on Earth is also getting into bigger and bigger emphasis. And beyond that, we are seeing how space is becoming an arena where people are actually trying to make use of the technological capability, not only to dominate over other places, other countries, but also influence the way life happens on this. And like the space as the 4th frontier, we are seeing a lot of developments, and private enterprise is growing very rapidly. Now in this time frame, what India is looking at is how can we make use of this technology of space, not only for ensuring growth, but also for ensuring that the aspiration of growing economically stronger needs one of the important domains to be brought into the economic activity, the space economy, how to become a significant player in the space economy. Towards this, we have seen that the government is bringing in new policies and also changing the manner in which the premier organization in the country which was conducting space activity needs to change the way it's working, and it is trying to bring in new methods and new policies, and then trying to enable people in the country to become very effective players. So today what we have is a set of very distinguished speakers who are going to tell us about how they look at this particular aspect of bringing the vision of making India a significant player in this space economy. And after listening to them, we will also go through a set of questions, and then the floor will be open for participants also to ask them questions. So with this small introduction, I would like to request our keynote speaker to deliver his talk.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we have the keynote address, I take this opportunity to acknowledge and welcome the honorable presence of the Honorable Minister in this session. We once again warmly welcome you, sir. And over to you, sir, for the keynote.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Chairman. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here today and to deliver this keynote. So today I'm going to talk a bit about, let's say, trends and challenges in the space sector and how this could shape or could be considered to shape the strategy for India in the future. So just a few words about me and about PwC. So I'm the partner in charge of space within PwC, and within PwC we have a dedicated practice that serves the space sector. It's a transversal practice that works cross line of service and assists clients worldwide. And we also have a dedicated strategy and policy-oriented team based in France that serves as a central hub supporting the needs of different teams across the world. We have a coverage, functional coverage that spans from technical to strategy to economics and even regulatory and legal. And we have done quite a lot of work supporting on space strategies worldwide, economic studies, organizational restructuring, and so on. We even have a dedicated offer that we call Insights from Space, where we actually work with non-space companies, supporting them in capacity building, so supporting them in embedding space data into their data processes and their workflow, which is something that we try to do by leveraging our expertise in space and our reach into non-space sector that are ensured by a large organization like PwC. Finally, I mean, we're very active in the community, so we're a member of the IAF, of the International Institute of Space Law. We work with several universities delivering courses and so on. We are also active developing and delivering free publications. And we have actually just recently released the third edition of our Trends and Challenges in Space. So I have a few copies available, and also it can be downloaded from our website. So just as an introduction, I mean, this is an educated audience, so there's probably not much need to go through here, but you know that the space sector is a very diverse sector that has a lot of specificities across the value chain, and that also encompasses a number of domains that are very, very specific in their dynamics and in their challenges. One of the generic trends that we can see across the value chain in space and that defines space as of late is the fact that we have seen a transition from the typical technology push of the past, where space assets and systems were developed and pushed into the market to develop applications, into a more demand-driven, let's say, dynamic, where, let's say, the needs of end users and the needs of applications are taken into account in order to design space systems that best serve those needs. There is also the so-called new space paradigm that impacts and addresses more or less the entire value chain. It's a term that has been used and overused. I think if we can define like the few characteristics of this paradigm, we can say that it actually realizes itself in the fact that the industry is the risk-taking entity right now, that there is a fast failure approach to innovation, as opposed, which is closer to the one of the tech industry, as opposed to the slower pace and more, let's say, safety-oriented approach of the defense industry. And it's something that is somehow sort of affecting a lot the way the space supply is brought into the market. So we see indeed industry taking the risk and serving the needs of different demand, a lot of which still remains, in any case, institutional, especially when we consider the upstream part of the value chain. We said earlier that space is very diverse, and it's, this is indeed true. It's also a sector that is relatively small in size, but has a vast reach. It actually impacts so many other sectors and so many parts of our lives that it can be considered indeed embedded into the broad economy in a very, very deep way. What does this mean? I mean, this means that being so, let's say, embedded into the broader economy, space is a sector that is affected by multiple macro trends. So it's affected by non-space macro trends, so trends that affect the economy as a whole. It's affected by boundary conditions that touch the sector and other sectors next to it. And then it's affected by trends that impact the space value chain across all domains. In addition to this, there is then specific dynamics and trends that impact each individual space domain. So it's a very, very complex picture to decode. And here, I mean, there's just a snapshot. There's just a snapshot of what we see in terms of this trend dynamic. So going from right to left on non-space macro trends, we see, of course, a strong push for sustainability and sustainable development and environmental, social, and governance, ESG. This is something, of course, that's driving the economy as a whole. It's a big push, and it has a strong impact on the space sector. On one side, space can be an enabler of solutions to drive ESG transition. On the other side, space also has in itself some environmental impacts. It has a footprint in the way it operates and so on, and so this is something that it needs to be taken into account. There is, of course, the digitalization. That is another major trend that impacts different sectors, and that includes space as well, and it has implications on the fact that it brings, on one side, a lot of potential, new ways of delivering services and products, and on the other side, also some let's say, opportunities, in terms of, for example, delivering new type of go-to-market approach, like the space as a service. At the same time, it also brings in some concerns on security. So cybersecurity right now is a growing concern and something that needs to be addressed in order to make space resilient. There is then the geopolitical environment. This is something that we also cannot ignore. So space is highly, let's say, interlinked with what goes on at geopolitical level. And when something happens at geopolitical level, it has broad repercussions on the way the space sector operates and the way the space sector interacts on the global scene. this is bringing as a consequence on the fact that space is somehow, while still global, also becoming regionalized. So we see more and more different regions around the world wanting to have a certain degree of sovereignty and access to critical technologies and assets. And at the same time, we also see a growing militarization of space. So leveraging space for defense and security, which, I mean, to be fair, it was always the case. Now it's really being sort of pushed even more and even more in the open. The last main trend that I wanted to maybe, let's say, highlight is the reach into other sectors. So this is something which, again, has always been there, but it's something that is increasing more and more right now. So we see more and more space becoming impactful on other sectors of the economy, financial services, energy, infrastructures, and so on, but even now entertainment, for example, and it's a trend that we anticipate will become more and more prevalent going forward. Then, of course, as I said, there are some domain-specific trends. So here it's really difficult to go in depth in a short time, but just to provide a few snapshots in here for the various domains. For Earth observation, so of course we know that there has been always a big push to have the downstream of Earth observation as the next gold mine in terms of space revenues and the next like big thing. There's been various attempts at proposing one-stop shops solutions, like sandbox platforms that could hold everything, you know, and generate innovation and generate products and revenues. We need to see that we need to say that this hasn't really worked out, and what we have seen instead, it's a growing interest in extremely vertically specialized products and insights. So this means that, I mean, since the real value of, you know, the use of Earth observation data is in the insights it produces, there is a need really to go vertically specialized and in-depth in order to produce meaningful insights. So the one-stop shop thing, it's very, very difficult to put in place. In access to space, I mean, we know that this is a very, very strategic sector. Clearly, I mean, you can have all the value in the downstream you want, but if you cannot put satellites in space, you will not have the downstream. So this is it's quite strategic, and it's a sector that is at the moment supply constrained. So there is quite an interest from new players to develop new solution, and there is also an interest from many territories to have access to space in their own on their own soil. So we see a proliferation of spaceports projects across the globe. Also on the realization that spaceports bring in a hub effect and broader economic benefits to the region that hosts them. SATCOM, I mean, it has been quite covered already quite extensively during the morning by people who know way better than me, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but you know that there is and there will be a growing demand for connectivity from different levels, and basically new type of LEO constellations can, and in particular, I mean more specifically, multi-orbit solution can help address these growing needs. On navigation, of course, this is a sector where most of the let's say, the innovation will probably, most of the commercial innovation is probably in the downstream, so in terms of devices and application and solutions. But even here, we can expect in the future the emergence of new type of constellations to further improve let's say, the precision of the positioning. There is a newly developed, well, I mean, there's a newly developing in-orbit economy. So this is a broader term that encompasses a number of economic activities connected to in-orbit operations. So this includes, of course, in-orbit servicing, space logistics, but also the you know, human space flight in low Earth orbit and beyond. As well as, of course, lunar exploration and so on. So this is, let's say, an interesting domain that is really developing a lot right now. And then, of course, there's space security. So space security is also a key domain from multiple points of view. On one side, because, of course, we want to ensure the sustainability of the space environment. So we want to make sure that all the stuff we're putting in orbit doesn't become unsustainable. And at the same time, there is also, like, of course, security implications and defense implications in order to associated with the possibility to track objects in orbit. In the downstream, as I said before, I mean, there's multiple sectors that we see as extremely promising. In the service industry, so insurance and finance, there's quite a huge interest for what space data can bring to the table in terms of providing reliable insights and in terms of enabling more accurate modeling, risk modeling in particular. On the energy side, there is, of course, a lot of attention in what space data can ensure to monitor infrastructure pipelines and things like this, but there is also an interest for the newly developed, well, I mean, not the newly developed, but the concept of space-based solar power, which, for the ones of you that are in the industry, you know it's a cyclical concept that comes out every decade or so and gets reevaluated. And right now it's getting quite some attention because maybe the enabling conditions are there in order for this concept to finally see the light. There are different downstream domains, including entertainment, video gaming, and so on, that can make use of space data. And there is, of course, the space tourism, which we have seen kicking off, I mean, in a more, let's say, widespread fashion last year, you know, with Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin with suborbital. And it's something that is gaining interest. Of course, it's also gaining controversy associated with the environmental impact that it brings. But it's definitely like a sector that should not be, a domain that should not be underestimated. So now moving into the specific India situation, no, I cannot say that I'm an expert in the say India space industry and so on, but I have to say it's one of the countries that I follow with the most interest. So it's definitely a country that has achieved incredible results and has extremely strong assets all across the space value chain and in most space domains. So this is definitely something to be extremely proud of for the country. There is quite a lot still that India can do, especially maintaining like the extremely successful track record that they had so far. Particularly, I mean, India is very, very strong right now. I mean, they have some strong upstream assets, and this could be leveraged and should be leveraged with investments and anchor tenancy from the government in order to bring it to the next level. So right now, India can be considered sort of a niche exporter of hardware and services associated to the upstream. This can be pushed further, and it can become a global leader with the right drive from the government in terms of investment and anchor tenancy. So it's absolutely the right move to delegate to the industry risk-taking. At the same time, as already mentioned, the government should ensure the right level of anchor tenancy in order for the industry to take off appropriately. On the downstream side, there is also quite a lot that India can do. So it can leverage an extremely strong national expertise in data and IT, which is something that can really bring a lot of value into the downstream sector. So even here, from the current mastering of selected verticals, India can broaden its leadership to cover most of the verticals in the data downstream market. Of course, I mean, our suggestion when moving this forward is to follow a structured approach which is something that we are already seeing. I mean, this is what we normally advise countries to do, and India is actually already doing part of it, you know, with their strategy and their, I think, soon to be announced policy. But in general, of course, each of these strategic objectives should be informed with a process that goes from the higher strategic objectives to more detailed policy targets in terms of industrial policy, educational policy, and research and knowledge development policy, while looking at the enablers that are needed in order to fulfill this, this plan, enablers that are the right governance in place for the country, the right regulatory frameworks, the right partnership in place at country level and internationally, and then, of course, the right support to the enterprise and the right access to finance. Then, of course, all of this needs to be further you know, tailored for each specific space domain that requires dedicated attention. And it should be informed by the macro trends, by the current baseline, assessing the current baseline of the country, and the domain-specific trends. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Luigi, for giving an exposure to what all things are there in space. And probably what we will do now is I'll request our next speaker, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, to give his thoughts on the various aspects of space activities, how India should be looking at going ahead. And Professor Sachin Chaturvedi is the Director General of Research and Information Systems, India. Please go ahead. About 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair. At the outset, I must thank you for leading us through Mr. Kiran Kumar for this deliberations, and I must also congratulate Luigi for very enlightening keynote address for the session. My dear fellow panelist, my old-time friend, Dr. Ajey Lele, I'm so glad to see you today here. Dr. Subba, Girish, I must also acknowledge presence of our very dear Honorable Minister Scatteia today. In his inaugural address today, he has emphasized two very important points in terms of India's commitment for 5 trillion economy and our endeavors to move in that direction, and Prime Minister's emphasis in terms of moving ahead with the idea of opening up of the space sector to have the larger accomplishments in that direction. And I think there the reference of the Atmanirbhar Bharat and trillion economy that he addressed, I think is extremely important. Chairman also, I think, very rightly mentioned in terms of how our space priorities have moved and in what way we are going to take in both the commitments, as our moderator this morning mentioned, space for space and space for all. I think that echoes the resilient spirit with which India launched ISRO's work, and in what way we emphasize the ideas in terms of both focusing in and also addressing the larger challenges. So from that perspective, I think it is largely stages set for the panel discussion. Friends and colleagues, in the 10 minutes that I have, I would just very quickly cover 3 broad ideas which I have in mind, and I would be rather quick. Number one is in terms of the huge systemic support that we are getting. The amount of legislative support, the amount of financial support, etc. So in one point I would cover that. Second is in terms of the larger efforts which are on in the global context, what efforts are being made by various agencies in way India is likely to figure. And third and last is, I think, in my view, as a policy researcher, is extremely important, and that India should not miss out on the bus that is there for norm setting. And I think in all the sectors where more and more transition we are seeing now from public sector to participation of private sector, we find this norm setting exercise on already. And that's where I think with the OECD and with other countries, we need to bring up the idea of how we see the rules of the game being set. In what way, as in one of the slides Luigi captured, and I'm so glad that the strategic roadmap that Luigi you chose is up to 2047, the Amrit Kal as we are calling it. And next 25 years, what kind of strategy we would have for this 5 trillion economy, as Scatteia ji mentioned, but also in terms of how we are going to be a player, we are also contributing to the rules of the game. And that, I think, is absolutely essential in terms of how we are going to go forward in this whole exercise. I think the idea in terms of bringing power and passion together is something that Honorable Prime Minister emphasized when he inaugurated in June in space. And that's where the power of the government, when they are present in the space sector, and passion of India's private sector. So the jump that we are seeing and the aspirations that we have for 5 trillion economy is basically focusing on the passion of the private sector, and that's what is to be connected with the huge cloud that ISRO has accumulated over the years with government's support, but also with the excellence in technology with help of our scientists. So how do we combine that? And the power of science, I think, would play an extremely important role for the private sector to be the co-traveler, as was emphasized. And I think from that perspective, a new mindset is required, and ISRO now is grappling with this transition which is happening, which is more supply-based to demand-based model. And this transition from supply to demand would entail several new features which are important both in terms of providing a predictable, forward-looking and enabling regulatory regime that is needed. And this regulatory regime again encompasses the points that I mentioned earlier in terms of finance, in terms of technology, in terms of access, and also, if I can add, the question of equity within that. And that probably would ensure a large set of new actors to come in, whether they come in from the MSME context or they are the large sectors themselves bringing in the venture capital and other sources of capital for the market. This, I think, is important in terms of how the financial architecture is being shaped, in what way financing is being made available for this important sector. Being on the board of governors of the Reserve Bank, we have been trying to see how some of these technologies can also usher in the new financial revolution that we are having. And then you are seeing the new RBI in last 3 years during the COVID period and even after that, the RBI's approach is, apart from the regulatory responsibility, also to facilitate growth. And that's where the element of endogeneity RBI has in a way excelled with in terms of norm setting on our own terms. And this is, friends, New India, which Prime Minister Modi is leading. In terms of how we are setting our own norms, those of you who understand finance would know very well the Basel norms that are there, and also the international financial institutions, including the International Monetary Fund, the amount of emphasis they have on inflation targeting, to focus on inflation. We did not do that. In last 2 years, our emphasis was on growth. Leave aside the discussions that international media had. India was even criticized by both Financial Times and economists for not addressing to inflation. And today, where are we? We are among some of the emerging economies where inflation is at the lower end. Others are now, after excessive control, even US is going towards recession. We are an upcoming economy and we are targeting at 5 trillion economy. That's the power of leadership, and that's the power of having faith in your own norm setting. And that's why I said the idea of norm setting is absolutely essential for any country which wants to be the world power. And I think from that point of view, India would have to devise its own pathway, and we would have to stop following Western hegemonic prescriptions in terms of how we go forward. But that does not mean that we do not partner with West. The idea of triangular cooperation, the idea of partnership with Western countries, international financial institutions, international global institutions is very much there. We are very much partnering with OECD, but the idea is also to see how best we devise our own pathway without disrupting the wider global governance. And I'm glad that Luigi in his keynote address alluded to the geopolitics, and we know which country he was referring to. So the idea is also in terms of how we look at the questions that are there and how we are going to go forward. But before that, our own house has to be brought in order. The Honorable Finance Minister has already given a huge budgetary push with 1,000 crores more in 22-23 budget, and almost a jump of 8.3% in the budgetary allocation. And this is an exercise which is going on right from 2047 and 2014 and would continue till 2024-25, as has already been indicated by the Finance Minister in her budget speech. So that, I think, has also given rise to the large number of startups which have come up. In 2014, there was just one startup, and now 2021, we had almost 47 startups. And this is something which is very much indicative of this jump from 2019 onwards, when in 2019 we had only 11 startups in the space sector. So this rise, which Economic Survey has captured in a beautifully written chapter on rise of our startup culture in this country, is another testimony to our efforts in terms of how we are going to go forward. This sector, in terms of putting our house in order, also requires the institutional support, and that, I think, through NSIL, through InSpace, through SPA, I think they are coming in, and their connect with Bharti Airtel, Larsen & Toubro, Tata Group, and many others is providing the scope and the ambit within which this sector has to come in. And that requires a huge set of suppliers, of producers, push for manufacturing, something that we neglected in lieu of our services sector-based economy, and that transition is happening. India would probably be one of the only emerging economy in the world which is now going from services sector back to basics and back to manufacturing, something that we left behind immediately after independence, and we are now going to catch up with that. A lot of catch up our economy has to do. I see now that my time is going to be up. I would just take 2 more minutes to just quickly focus on my idea of norm setting, and that's where I think the leadership of our private sector organization, the Director General here, I had brief discussions with him. We are very keen to support in terms of setting the norms that are needed. And I think OECD has already come out with certain definitions, and these definitions, friends, are important for us also to contribute in terms of what is defined as a space economy. What are the various features that are going to be part of the value chain? It cannot be part of those sectors which are upcoming, the sectors which are to be defined in terms of course of exploring, researching and understanding, both in terms of the range of activities, the value chain, what should be part of the value chain, how global financial institutions would then look into finances and financing of those sectors. So if we capture the concepts right, the larger finances that are available through international financial institutions would come up, and that's where our attention should be. Sometimes we think that the sector would organically grow. It would grow organically, but would require enough bandwidth for us to capture the essence, and that's where India should be the part of the system which OECD is trying to bring in. The open sourcing and the intellectual property related impediments which may also come in are also important for us to define, both in terms of the industrial classification that is followed by OECD, but also in terms of what space technologies are to be classified within the idea of security and not being allowed. And from that point of view, our idea of bringing space technologies close to our socio-economic objectives, be that in the agriculture or in pharmaceuticals, the land record setting for the states, etc., are important factors which are going to contribute in a major way. The sector which was envisaged to be at 469 billion in 2014 in the OECD report now has crossed almost 2 times of that, and very soon would be going to be 1 trillion in 2040. And from that perspective, the idea of norm setting requires small groups to address the value chains, and also trying to see how the investors, their modalities and their engagements are captured in terms of business in space growth cycles that we are going to follow. And this, friends, before I close, I just want to also mention in terms of the debt instruments, the venture capital instruments, the taxations, the global concessions that are required are some things which have already been brought by several industries in the past. And that's where our industry would have to be vigilant in terms of what kind of concessions we can get in terms of global negotiations. Those of you who are following WTO negotiations, my own organization at RIS, we have been very closely following WTO negotiations. Countries which had the strength to supply the consumer goods for electronics got global exemptions on tax right from 1997 under International Information Technology Agreement ITA 1, 1998, and ITA 2, 2015. I think time has come when we envisage of global conventions which are going to give these tax concessions, and that's where I was emphasizing on the perspective that I did in terms of norm setting and also in terms of deciding the new ways to finance this sector. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Sachin, for bringing in that perspective and also emphasizing the need for norm setting. Now I would request Dr. Ajey Lele, who is the consultant, Manohar Parrikar-Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Morning to all of you. Morning to my fellow panelists. I think much has been already said by the two speakers. So in a limited 10-minute what I'm supposed to speak will be a very short and crisp. If you really look at it, the title for this particular panel discussion, what should be India's space strategy in the future? Whenever such type of topics are given, I'm very happy, because when you talk on futures, you're not responsible for what you talk out. So life is pretty easy in that context. Well, having said that, since India's space entire journey has been a very fascinating journey for a couple of years now, and India's space, basically ISRO, has covered a lot of ground. So to cover the entire gamut of what should be the future of a space may be slightly too much problematic to finish it in 10 minutes or so. So I thought that I will restrict my talk basically on the aspects related with security. As it was been rightly pointed out, space is about geopolitics. Just to state a simple case, that the first satellite which was launched in the year 1957 was called Sputnik. And in the year 2019, when Russia came out with a vaccine for COVID, they also called it Sputnik. Basically, there was some sort of a messaging over here. In those days, we were good into basically space technologies, rocket technologies, and today we are good into biotechnologies. That's why the same name got repeated, the Sputnik name, even for the vaccine also. Well, having said that, when I'm supposed to look at a specific aspect of a security, I thought I will look at it at 3 to 4 levels. One is that the military aspect of it. The second is what we call as a space weaponization or a space warfare aspect of it. Third, the technology aspect of it. And lastly, certain amount of the policy prescriptions. When I'm talking of a military aspect of it, we all know that after the 1991 Gulf War, everybody understood the importance of space technologies basically for the military purposes. And these technologies, basically the communication technologies, the intelligence gathering technologies, what we call as a signals intelligence, communication intelligence, imagery intelligence and all that. Then subsequently the space was used very beautifully during this particular conflict, and even today it is being used for the GPS systems. So that is another aspect of it. So broadly speaking, if one has to look at a military dynamics of a space, one looks at communication technologies, one looks at remote sensing or earth observation technologies, what we call reconnancy technologies, and one looks at basically the navigational technologies. So where India stands today as far as these technologies are concerned, and where India's entire investment should go in the future only from a military perspective. I think it is a globally accepted fact that when you use these types of technologies for the military purposes, you are not breaking any rules, you are not breaking any norms. So this is what we call the militarization of a space, and which is a done thing. As far as India is concerned, India has already launched satellites for Indian Air Force and Indian Navy a couple of years back. In 2013, first satellite was launched for Indian Navy. And now, definitely when you're going to look at the future, you will be requiring more communication satellites which are exclusively for Air Force, Navy, even for Army and then paramilitary forces too. Because India's security module, if you see, it's not only Army, Navy, Air Force. There is a major role played by paramilitary forces also. And they also will require good amount of input from the space technologies. So it's not only going to get limited to the communication aspects of it. Remote sensing, what we call earth observation satellites, we all understand that space technology is inherently a dual-use technology. So a lot of satellite systems which India is already having could be considered as a dual-use satellite systems. And I think there has to be a more amount of the number of systems which are going to be there. Because you are in the game of reconnancy, you do not have the 24/7 visibility because your polar orbiting satellites has got limitations, you got limited number of satellites. So I think in the future, the number of those satellites, the number of other intelligence gathering mechanism satellites are also going to come up in future. As far as spy satellites are concerned, again, the same type of a satellite technology also gets christened as a spy satellite technology. There are a lot of new technologies which are getting developed. There are a lot of new sensors which are getting developed. I think India needs to work not only development of a satellite, but particularly on the sensor technologies from the military perspective. As far as navigation is concerned, India already has got a regional navigation system. I think the time is going to come where India need to think whether they need to expand from a regional navigational system to a global navigational system. Because you got a satellite, say around 7 to 8 satellites, they are taking care of your regional requirements. But the way conflicts are occurring today, you just don't know that not only from a fighting point of view. Today you had a problem in Ukraine, you got to take the Indian students out of it, you require a certain amount of assistance from the armed forces too. So from that perspective, I think there could be a need in coming years where India need to go for a GPS which will be, or a navigational system which will be at a global level. So as far as military aspects are concerned, I think these are the issues where the future could lie over there. As far as weaponization aspects are there, I think the concept of a space warfare is not new now. People have started talking about it. There are few people who are convinced that tomorrow's warfare could be fought in that space. India has got a policy formulation where India is against the weaponization of a space or any sort of a space warfare. I think this sort of a policy should continue for tomorrow also, for coming years also, because it is not in interest of anybody to unnecessarily weaponize the space. But at the same time, India has to be slightly akin to the fact that India's adversaries are investing so much into counter-space technologies. And basically because of that, India has already undertaken an anti-satellite test very successfully, just to demonstrate, just to put in on the table that yes, we got a deterrence mechanism. So as far as counter-space technologies are concerned, there are lot many technologies, right from directed energy weapons to various other technologies which could be spoken of. But I think since India has a stated policy of not getting into the domain of a space warfare per se, only from a perspective of a deterrence mechanism, India has already done an anti-satellite test. I think there could be a case where India could make investments into basically the jamming technologies, where you could use a jamming technologies from a cyber domain or a jamming technologies from the laser domains also. I think that could be prudent as far as India is concerned, instead of getting into high-end technologies where you are going to go and attack satellites and all that. Now coming to the modern technologies, why I'm talking of modern technologies from a military perspective, because I have already said that as far as the domain of a space is concerned, it's all dual-use technologies. Today we are in the era of Industry 4.0. A lot of disruptive technologies are being talked on, being worked on. I think all these technologies could have certain amount of inputs as far as military-specific weapons, military-specific space systems could be produced or could be designed and developed. There are few technologies which are commonly known, like artificial intelligence, blockchain. Then you got a satellite IoT also. These technologies are going to play a very major role. Then you got to look at minerals and materials also, because at end of the day, as far as launching of a satellite is concerned, weight is going to be a major issue. So that is again one technology. I think 3D printing technology could be a game changer as far as entire economy is concerned, the industrial economy is concerned. You already got certain amount of investments which have been made internationally. I think if my memory goes correct, there is a relativity space or some agency which has already produced 3D printers to produce rockets, to develop engines, and they have already started by using 3D printing technology to launch satellites also. So this is again one technology that is going to come handy, not only for a civilian domain, but for a military domain also. Then there has been always a demand as far as launching systems are concerned, that you require a launch on demand. I think with small satellite launch vehicle, India has reached to a certain level as far as launch and demand is concerned. But this is again an area where India need to push. And in the future, I think that could be the another area. Then there are a lot of other ideas like space situational awareness, where you require the entire network of telescopes, satellites, and various other systems just to understand what is happening out into the space. Space weather becomes a very important element the moment you are going to raise your domain of a space to the deep space. Then subsequently, there are going to be issues as far as space traffic management is concerned. Because if you see number-wise, during last couple of years, only lot amount of satellites which have been already launched into a low Earth orbit, and already there is a cry that low Earth orbit is getting cluttered. So under those circumstances, a time is going to come when space traffic management is going to become a very major issue. Then in-orbit servicing is also becoming a very important issue. As far as space debris are concerned, you got a lot amount of space debris mitigation guidelines and other issues, but many technologies, new technologies are being thought of. Why I'm making those mention to all these technologies from a perspective of a military? Because in today's world, we just don't know how to define a space weapon. So under those circumstances, all these activities, if they are done without any check, and I entirely agree with Dr. Sachin when he spoke about norms building, because all these activities demand certain amount of a rule mechanism, norms building, so on and so forth. So one has to really look at all these issues also. Then one more element which may not be the reality for the today, but tomorrow particularly management of the resource is going to be a very big problem. And we need to have certain amount of norms building. Just to give you an example, in the year 2015, the then US President Obama came out with a policy that any private agency, if it goes to asteroids, undertakes asteroid mining and gets back the stuff, it belongs to that private agency. I think when we are talking of a space as a common heritage to mankind, these types of individual state-centric norms building is not going to help. And in years to come, we got to look at all these issues also. So I thought that broadly speaking, when I look at India, if I'm borrowing the terminology from Joseph Nye, that for all these years we are looking at a space as a soft power. But I think the time is going to come where we need to have a look at space not as a hard power or soft power, but as a smart power. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Luigi, for bringing in that security perspective in the space activities. Now I would request Dr. Subba, who is the president of SIA and also CMD Ananth Technologies, to give his views.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, distinguished panelists and friends around. Perhaps I'll try to give you a different perspective to the whole issue. Here, the topic here is strategy for the future and vision into action. That being the case, perhaps I should recall that there are two types of visions that we had it in the country. Of course, both are aligned with each other. One vision that proclaimed by Dr. Vikram Sarabhai those days was, it was more to solve the problems of the common man in the country. That's how he wanted the space technology to be used. So towards that, we didn't have any kind of a technology with us. We didn't have any other wherewithal also to do that. But with the limited resources, they went on developing the technologies in the sense that, we started building up to land the satellites building, built the launch vehicle building, then started building of those things, simultaneously also working on the application side of the technology to solve the common problems. So that was the vision that Vikram Sarabhai emphasized that point of time on that. And with that, in fact, we entire ISRO, when I say, sometimes I'm industry, I'm also from ISRO, both sides, okay? So ISRO went on building up a lot of mission projects in the applications area. For example, you take the dry land areas in the country, there is a wasteland management or watershed management programs. That's where the IRS data was extensively being used to retain every drop of rainwater and put it for the usage. So that's where the satellite technology enabled for the people to understand where the technology can be used, how that can be used, how to gain the technology benefits out of that. And when you're looking from that angle, the present Prime Minister has realized that this type of activity can be done not only by ISRO alone. Of course, ISRO also taking a lot of support from the industries. And now the industries also can on their own work on that. That means, in other words, the complete potential of the industry is to be realized on its own. That is the vision that has been emphasized in the Prime Minister's speech, and the policy has been emphasized accordingly on that. Now, when you look at both are aligned with each other. The one is the government doing it, other one is on the industry working for the government. The other side is the industry on its own doing it, part of it. So to enable this to happen, what should be the action plan for the government of India or for the industry on that? The action plan, what you see is most of the time, once the government vacates certain fields, perhaps the private industry could do much better in that sector. For example, let's look at the simple solution that have been provided to make India self-sufficient in food grains. We had CSR laboratories. The laboratories they're finding out the new seed, new varieties of how to advising the farmers to do that. And the government has built the water resources, in terms of dams, canals, etc. They're given to the farmer, and the farmer was growing the crops. So look at the way the entire enabled. Their government is the enabler, and the people on their own. Similar in the space sector today, the government is enabler, and the industry is on its own. Industry is something equivalent to like a farmer in the country. Okay, therefore it will become much more, they can always reach the greater heights with this type of initiative. This is one part of it. Then let's look at the infrastructure in the country. It was completely managed by the government earlier, and slowly there are a lot of reforms came in, and the ports, harbors, roads, airports, that being managed by the private sector today. Now, what the government has become an enabler, and there is a public-private participation that's happening on that. And now we expect under the new policy to make the vision into an action. We expect the government of India also to encourage such a public-private participation into this. So for this, perhaps some laws have to be put into action, like the infrastructure laws in the country and other acts in the country. Perhaps those acts are now also being emphasized and being drafted, and I'm sure the industry can perform much better in this area also from that angle on that. The other one is the Indian industry, Indian space program was confined largely to India earlier. Now, the satellite for anything is global in nature. And the friends have been talking about mostly the IR and so on, which is regional navigation part of it can become the global part of this. So when that kind of ideas come up into that, I'm sure the Indian industry can rise to the occasion and they can become global. So we're talking about something like, the small satellites constellation is being built in that. That can be left out something like in a private industry. They can go global in that. So in order to do that, of course, our friends, the panelists have already explained how the finances, etc., to be made available into that. And our friend from PwC has explained the kind of complete initiation of what the space can do in various sectors on that. And similarly, when you come to the defense sector, you really require a huge amount of satellites for that. We have a large marine to be protected. And where the Himalayas other side, where the enemy is also all around. So therefore, a lot of activity in the space sector also can be done. Once this is enabled to the private sector to do that, of course, all the policies are on, IDEX, etc., already been announced, the Prime Minister. Once that happens, I'm sure the private industry will rise to the occasion and do that. In other words, to make the vision into action, please give more role to the private industry in this country. The private industry in this country can rise to the occasion, every sector, and I'm sure it will happen in the space sector also. So that's what we're looking forward onto that. So that's the only thing, vision to start, transfer the vision into the action onto that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Subba, for bringing in that perspective. Now I would request Mr. Girish Chandran, Vice President, CTO, Viasat, to give his views.
Is this live? Yeah, okay. Thank you. I think the speakers who have gone in front of me have covered most of the things that I was hoping to cover, but so I'll give you a slightly different perspective. I don't presume to advise the Indian government on space strategy, but I'll give you a perspective of some of the observations of things that have worked in the US that might be applicable here in the Indian context as well. So Mr. Lele, who went a little ahead, he mentioned the balanced use of space. Dual use is the word you used. And I think that's an interesting perspective because, space has both civilian and commercial uses, as well as the numerous use cases that Mr. Lele outlined. So that's sort of something to think about in terms of dual use of space. And I think the public-private cooperation that Mr. Subbarao mentioned also is an important one. So on Viasat, so just by way of introduction, Viasat is a company based out of California, but it has a global footprint. It's about $3 billion. It's organized into three divisions. It's got a commercial division, it has a government systems division, and it has an enterprise and mobility division. So on our board is the former NASA administrator, so the head of NASA, who started the Artemis program. So the Artemis program is sort of US's invitation to both private enterprises as well as other nations to go back to the moon. And as part of the initiative, the NASA administrator, basically NASA funded SpaceX and a number of other companies to create rockets, reusable rockets, and modules to service the international space stations and so on and so forth. So NASA sort of, today's discussion earlier in the morning by the ISRO chair, Mr. Somnath, sort of reflected, it occurred to me that he was sort of echoing many of the things that we saw as being successful in the US, where it sort of created a very large number of industries with a little bit of nudge from NASA, and enabling new, even startups, right? They run competitions, and they try to tap into even high school kids. They run competitions. They run competitions for startups, and they fund potential growth areas. So for example, high growth areas like, I think there was solar energy being mentioned. So Department of Energy wants to generate solar-based a gigawatt station out of a satellite in space, right? That's the equivalent of, so if you have a gigawatt in space, that's more than what an Idiki dam generates, or 5 such satellites can generate as much power as what UP state generates. So that's an example. There are 2 configurations. One is a low Earth orbit with laser transmission down to Earth, and the other one is a microwave transmission with big solar panels and so on and so forth. So that's an example of something DOE funds is sort of looking at a private enterprise, and the technologies, as I think Luigi pointed out, it keeps coming back, but it seems to have legs this time around. So those are examples of public-private partnerships which have enabled a large ecosystem of companies to grow. Some other growth areas that get, I think people mentioned debris removal, and some of these satellite tests create a lot of debris, which creates hazards for everybody, all nations in the world, and so somebody has to go to clean up, that stuff. So there's companies that are stepping up to now start to clean up that. In-orbit servicing was mentioned, and there are Momentous is a company that's trying to do in-orbit servicing. There's been a numerous well-publicized ventures into space by private citizens, both on Blue Origin, on Virgin, on SpaceX, and now companies like Sierra Nevada and so on are starting to create modules that people can go on to ISS or just in space. So there are both, again, it's sort of somewhat dual use, Sierra Nevada being both a commercial contractor as well as a defense contractor. So there are space travel and space habitation, both on commercial side as well as defense side. And then there was a discussion around in-space manufacturing. So there are companies now, somebody mentioned, I think it was Professor Chaturvedi, maybe he mentioned relativity space, I can't remember, maybe that was him. Yeah, so there are these companies that do 3D printed engines on Earth, but what in-space manufacturing is really launching stuff, then you print stuff while in space so that you don't have to carry these very large, very delicate things into space. You can manufacture things in space. So 3D printing in space is one of the areas that is a potential growth area. And then there are other kinds of things around, there are some NASA-funded efforts around data centers in space. So data centers require a lot of cooling, and that's the biggest bill that they have. So what if you launched data centers in space, right? So all of this really, there are people working in the next generation of what does it mean to have internet in space, right? So you have to have delay-tolerant networking. So going from here to the moon, or people inhabiting Mars, how do you communicate with them? So those are new protocols, new kinds of networks are being designed. So Vint Cerf, who's one of the founders of the TCP protocol, which sort of one of the fathers of the internet, he's quite interested in, and there are a number of other space buffs who are interested in designing and thinking about what new networks in space look like. So these are examples of private enterprise, aided by a little bit of government or quasi-governmental agencies giving nudges that sort of create entire ecosystems and a vibrant economy, which Luigi spoke about earlier. So those are examples which might perhaps open up people's, I know there are some folks from startup companies here. So it's really about creating just the light regulation to open up the imaginations of people, to create the freedom to go innovate, to find the funding that Professor Chaturvedi talked about. That's a really key element. So to be able to have access to find the right kind of money is really, really important. So to create an ecosystem, it cannot, the importance of that cannot be understated, the financing of these things. So space can be fairly expensive, and it's not just venture funds, but what does it mean to get insurance? So how do you insure things? So today, a lot of insurance is done by large Exim Bank, or there is an equivalent one in Europe, and so on and so forth. So there is some things around how do you finance space activities. So there's some thought needs to be given to that. But all of this requires use of space in a very sustainable fashion. Space is a common resource for all of humanity. And how do you monitor what's going on in space? So there's a lot of debris floating around in space, some of which can be monitored, things that are millimeter small to about a centimeter, or those cannot be monitored. Sort of 10 centimeters and above is somewhat easier. So 10 centimeters is sort of the size of this bottle. So think of this bottle getting shot at you at through a rail gun, which is, and maybe not even a rail, it's at these tremendous velocities, which is 3 times faster than a speeding bullet coming at you, right? Which it's hard to, so space debris management and monitoring is really, really important. Last couple of times there were people in the space station trying to take cover from debris that was, and there's pictures of debris hitting space station. So this is a real important thing that needs to be monitored, and space sustainability is a really, really important topic. In order to have an economy, you need to make sure the environment is sustainable, right? So some norms or some sort of global coordination activities need to happen. Perhaps India can take the lead there in those kinds of activities. I think Mr. Lele spoke about nav and jamming and other kinds of things, which we are seeing now really getting played out in real time in the Ukraine war and other kinds of theaters of action. So I think the idea is for India, look at space potentially, in a more holistic way as a balanced dual use kind of thing. Space and security are interlinked, and security includes not just sort of the classical definition of security, but also security in terms of sustainability as well. So those are some of the things that I wanted to mention, and so the three things is really balanced use of space, sustainable use of space, and really if you have those things, then you can create these high growth opportunities and create these public-private partnerships. And in order to create those, you need the sort of light touch regulation that allows these industries to flourish and access to capital. Those are the main comments I wanted to make.
Thank you, Girish, for that perspective. So if you see today, in the sense that while India started this activity of again space with a particular objective, primarily with the civilian applications in mind, today we see a very different world. We are now looking at how this space has become all-encompassing, and so much of requirements of human beings on Earth is dependent on what is happening in space. And in this context, today what you are looking at in this particular panel was turning vision into action. Now vision itself, which was originally like what Dr. Subba mentioned, Vikram Sarabhai came up with the idea of harnessing space technology for societal benefits. But today, country's vision is no longer limited only to that. Not only because the times have changed, the world has changed, and today for survival of the nations also, dependence on space is increasing, and how you master or how you develop your own capabilities in that makes a difference. And at the same time, the governments also do not have infinite resources to conduct activities all that is needed. So the government is also trying to look at the private enterprise to do all those activities which they can do to provide solutions to the both within the country and across the country globally. And also, as we are seeing, space is becoming a mechanism not only for tourism, adventure, but also for actually getting different types of resources, and also the human endeavor of looking beyond Earth and moving outside and habitats, etc. There is a host of these things going on. But then today what we really need to look at is, many times earlier when this entire activity was too much under the state control, some things were happening, but today things have changed, that private enterprise is doing the entire planning of the space activities, and they have already done many activities which are outside the government's regime. And like in many other areas, very soon you will also see in space these things happening. But today in the country, if you look at whether the private enterprise should all the time be depending on government deciding something and making it happen, are there activities where, like actually Subba mentioned, that in India also you have seen, there are many areas where the private enterprise has been very successful when government regulations or restrictions were minimal. And if government has not entered a certain area, in those areas, private enterprise has been able to do a lot more. But then space, by virtue of the nature itself, it was not possible for such a thing to happen. But today the country is looking at enabling private enterprise. So in this context, probably the panelists did bring out some of the perspectives, and what we need to see is look at in the short term, medium term, and long term. In all these three terms, what the enterprise can do and how it can enable India not only to improve and become bigger economic power, but also play a very meaningful role in the existence of the global humanity itself. And this is where probably the norm setting and then actually dialoguing with others and those participants of the space activity, what kind of negotiation should happen, would all come into picture. I think maybe I'll just throw open the panelists to questions from the audience. Any of you who want to ask some questions may go ahead, please.
Sir, I must congratulate on the panel for an extremely well discussed, strategy. But there is one big enabler for the private industry to come into this fold will be the security. The security is supposed to be provided by the government. That is the basic role of the nation. So if we require a lot of assets to go to this space, how do we secure them? First, if we can define the area where we can put my assets, then perhaps a security can be built. Like when we started with a land border, we went to territorial water, as economic activities went up, then we went to exclusive economic zone. Now further, that is the way it is expanded. Is similar thing being thought of when we put the assets, the space above the country or its exclusive economic zone belongs to that country, though for economic exploitation. So similar convention, if it can be through United Nations, can be created, so that will be a more attraction to the private industry, because he knows whether his items are secured or not and who is looking after him too. So this will be a part of the big norm setting, which perhaps the Space Commission can take up. Your comments on that?
I think this is a point in question, but whether the mechanisms that we have been following for what you are talking about, land, ocean, etc., whether it's applicable for beyond the Kármán line space is a point in question. But anyway, this point we will keep it as part of the efforts that are required, how to deal with such issues in future. Probably it needs to be addressed. But I don't think today, if you look at what is happening globally, many people are not too much concerned about that. They're ready to pump in and then get into space activities and do business with that. So probably this is where we also need to be clear that there will be concern, there will be issues, but it's only those who are ready to take the risks, they'll succeed. But your point will definitely be part of the intergovernmental discussions and United Nations and Astronautical Congress discussion point. Thank you.
Excuse me.
Yeah, okay. Just 1 second. He has the mic right now. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon, sir. I am Captain Agnihotri from National Maritime Foundation. And my question is to Dr. Subba. Sir, you spoke about a lot of scope being there in the private sector for contributing towards India's space journey, so to say. My question is that the government has formed a government body, public sector body called New Space India Limited, which is providing services in 5 odd domains, commercial services, across the whole spectrum of space applications for other countries to avail the facilities of. With that kind of a public sector undertaking, providing virtually all these space-based services available, I would like to know your, I would say, comments on what is the scope left for the private sector other than just contributing to the New Space India Limited efforts. Thank you, sir.
No, in fact, this question should have been directed to who? Dr. Kiran Kumar too, but former chairman. But however, I will tell you only one thing. There is what is known as the Lakshmana Rekha. So the government, which has formed NSIRSA for a different connotation, for a different objective, that part of it, okay? But it's not necessarily that it doesn't prevent the private industry to work on their own. That's the reason why there is also a regulator. InSpace has been created. Like for example, let's look at the financial sector. Earlier, all the banks were managed by the government banks, they call public sector undertakings. Later, they started giving the licenses to private sector banks also. Then in order to have everything in the even ground, they created SEBI, a regulator. Similarly, in the telecom area, earlier the BSNL, VSNL, whatever, they were the responsible. Subsequently, the private industry came in. So they created a regulator, TRI. Similarly, in the space also, similar activity is going to happen in the similar fashion. And there is no reason today that private industry can withhold itself saying that, we work only for NSIL kind of thing. The scenario is not there at all. For example, today we want to build a constellation of satellites, we build it on our own. Only thing is, my proposal has to be the bankable proposal, in the sense that then I should get the financing from the banking system or venture capital, whatever. There should be a bankable proposition. To get the bankable things, that's where we need the government has to come forth with a clear-cut terms on that. For example, if you look at what's happening in the USA, for example, somebody is putting up the money into this kind of venture. I'm talking about Earth observation satellites, say. I'm sure the US government comes forward and they underwrite something like 50% of the data will be bought by the government agencies on that. So that enables them to raise the money from the banking systems or whatever venture capital in that. We don't have that type of a guarantee in this country. So whatever we do it on our own. I mean, again, to compare with a farmer in the village, he grows paddy, whatever, okay? Where is the guarantee that somebody will buy it from him? There is no guarantee. He may not. He has to struggle on his own, he should sell it and make it viable for himself. We have a similar scenario today. Even in the space industry, also a similar scenario. Now this has to grow to the level where the government should handhold in terms of policies and other things. That's where we wanted today. The session is about vision into action. And as Dr. Kiran mentioned just now, that this will bring it to the notice of various other government agencies also, and will make the policy, whatever, act in such a way that there will be support to systems available for the private industry too in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, Mr. Chairman. I am S.D. Saxena. I worked in the ground segment in Sat-1 when the satellite came to India. And I would like to share with you the business model which ISRO followed that time. They didn't charge any money for the transponder to telecom or to the television. And you can see how the industry grew and how people were benefited. Now, I have a question which is posed to Mr. Girish Chandran and to Dr. Subba and you, sir. The point is that when will India have companies like SpaceX and Virgin Atlantic that they can start launching satellites? Because I understand the hand-holding by NASA and some of these agencies is immense. Because a private operator, when he's going to space, has very little of revenue stream to show. And I have also been a finance professional. I know for a long time, for example, the space pointers are towards space exploration like Mars and Moon and so on, where there is no revenue stream right now. So if a company goes to the market, they will get no investment. Therefore, what are the plans for the space, as you are the member of Space Commission, to really fund these enterprises where huge amount of money, billions of dollars will be needed? And maybe Mr. Girish Chandran can educate us on what kind of money SpaceX or Virgin Atlantic get when they are launching these kind of projects. Thank you, sir.
I don't presume to know what SpaceX's finances are, but it's not that hard to calculate. So a Falcon 9 launch is roughly in the, the market price. Sorry?
The Mars project is funded 90%.
Yeah. So there is this deep space sort of ambitions, but a lot of the business, the fundraising for that is generated by a combination of, say for example, if you had to go around in Mars, you couldn't set up power plants. You need to have some way to tap solar energy. So you set up Solar City, which is a company that makes batteries, and then you need to drive around. You need cars which are powered by batteries, and solar powered things. So you need solar chargers and batteries. So you create Tesla. You need to communicate. It's very, very hard to dig trenches and, but there is a boring company. And then there is a satellite a constellation to communicate between if you had a colony on Mars. So there are business models that are used to fund what futures might look like, but business models that work on Earth. So there is sufficient demand for Tesla, sufficient demand for lower cost launches. And if you look at Starship, the cost of launch per kilogram is getting driven down very substantially. So, that could potentially create new kinds of payloads that can go on it. So, but a lot of the venture funding that happens in the US is not based on actual revenue that you make this year or next year, but how big is the market and how quickly can you get access to large markets. So that's the way venture capital gets funded. Take, for example, Uber, right? They didn't make money, they haven't made money for a long time, but they got hundreds of millions of funding. So it's simply because you can access global markets, and if you can have a competitive advantage, then those initiatives get funded. And there are certain business models that have this idea of, either the first or the second mover gets all, right? So it's not, hey, everybody lives all nicely and happily together. It's being very aggressive and, getting after these markets. And those are ventures that get funded fairly aggressively if there is, these dramatic growth curves. So that's an example of how I've seen venture funds get dedicated. So if you look at SpaceX, the valuation, they've raised quite a lot of money over the last many years from private venture funds, in addition to funding from Mars and the military and so on and so forth. I don't know if that helps you.
Sure, yeah. Thank you. So how do you say that India does not have a SpaceX yet? India has a SpaceX already. Our business models are something different than what USA and Europe has. For example, let's look at the vaccination. The kind of vaccination that has been, 140 crore population in this country, every one of us been vaccinated. Not once, twice. How did it happen? If you compare in the same fashion with the USA or Europe, they are not vaccinated as much as India had that. So therefore, we have a different models altogether. For the companies which have been producing the vaccination, money was made available in a different fashion. Not necessarily venture capital should come forward, something else should come forward on that. When you come to the space, similarly, for example, SSLV, which is going to be, very soon, very, very successful onto that. That itself can launch the satellite much cheaper than what SpaceX is doing today in USA. So therefore, we have a SpaceX, a similar models in this country. Number two, there are a couple of startup companies who are also experimenting on the launch vehicle side, trying to have the satellites on demand. And we can see some success already in them. I'm sure those things will be further successful on that. So therefore, we don't have to call the SpaceX. You call it Subarov X or Venkatrav X, whatever you call them. They're going to be that. We have that kind of things in this country. Thank you.
And I think the point we need to appreciate is, if we were to follow methods which have been adopted and successful elsewhere, do you think in that particular path we will be able to make a difference? Definitely, if we look at something different, something other than what people have done and succeeded, that is where the new paths are possible. This is where really what we need to see is, today in the overall environment where the country is looking at providing an opportunity, now the people who are in the private sector looking at what can be done by the examples of others. If, for example, in the country, ISRO also has demonstrated in space technology area, it is not only with your own direct experience or your own things that you succeed. When you start looking at how others have done and what you can do differently from them, that is the one which can take you to a different trajectory and to do something more, like what he mentioned about even vaccination and other areas also. It's very similar. I think today is an opportune time where space activities is going beyond the conventional thought processes, where the governments were the only players playing a big role. Now there is opportunity for the private players also to get in. This has already been demonstrated by many companies across the globe. If India things have to happen differently, people also have to look at with respect to what access they have for technologies, and using those access, providing service. Today we also saw the actual service sector is $280+ billion, or almost 85% of the total. So we are actually talking about only the 15% of enabling technologies. I think the real application and use where we are expecting the private sector to take up and move ahead. And if they are able to bring in that 85%, the government's ability to provide that enabling 15% is definitely guaranteed. That's how we need to look at the problem. So today, as we are seeing that the whole process from LEO to GEO, now the satellites becoming constellations of 10,000, 20,000, and each of these satellites also are doing multiple functions. From communication, we saw other day somebody pointing out how SpaceX's satellites can be used for providing navigation services even outside what SpaceX is thinking. So there's becoming a combination where satellites provide communication, navigation, remote sensing, all kinds of things put into a single satellite. So things are changing rapidly. So what we need is people who can actually visualize from what is available in terms of technology and bringing in services which are very different, not only to our own country, but also to the global community. And that is where events like this, where bringing people together and making them aware of many thought processes that are going across the different entities in the country will make a difference. So I would like to compliment all the panelists for giving their perspective. And like I said, today, one of the key things that happened few days back is a real demonstration. See, what the country demonstrated is a new vehicle which had not shown earlier that it could put commercially certain satellites into space. Here, it's a combination of a private enterprise accepting this company or this entity, taking the risk, though they have not demonstrated, they were ready to go and risk their 36 satellites going into space. Now the organization itself took a big risk in modifying its one of most competent launch vehicle, turned it into a system delivery. So like this, if you look at, it is the dynamism of the players ready to take risk that will provide success. And this launch really brought in this Diwali a great new kind of environment and new kind of optimism. And we are looking at the entire private enterprise to take off on this note and take the country forward in an area which is going to be really essential, not only for country's survival, but also for humanity's survival. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, sir, for wonderfully chairing and moderating this session. Also, ladies and gentlemen, let's once again put our hands together for all our eminent panelists and speakers, our keynote speaker for the wonderful presentations we had. Thank you once again to each one of you. And ladies and gentlemen, with that, we close the proceedings of this session, inviting all of you to join us for lunch. Lunch is once again served in the pre-function area outside Desire Hall. And the lunch will be for almost 1 hour. We request you all to be seated back by 2:30 p.m. Thank you. And I would once again bring to attention the startups. Tomorrow we have mentorship lunch and meeting at the lunch hour in Inspire Hall. You all are kindly requested to register for the same. Thank you.